Hello, and welcome to the Future of Transportation panel, everyone. My name is Brian Murray, and I'm the director of the Duke University Energy Initiative, as well as a faculty member at Duke's Nicholas School of the Environment and Sanford School of Public Policy. For those who don't know, the Duke University Energy Initiative is Duke's interdisciplinary hub for all things energy related. We reach across business, engineering, environment, law, policy, and the arts and sciences at Duke to educate tomorrow's energy innovators, develop new solutions through research, and improve energy decisions by engaging business and government leaders. You can learn more about us and what we do at energy.duke.edu, and I believe that address has been put in the chat box. So thank you so much for joining us today. Of course, this event was originally supposed to happen face-to-face on Duke's campus in concert with a networking reception. And while it's disappointing to change those plans, I'm really delighted to know that the virtual format of this event has made it possible for folks in far-flung locations to attend it, and to get a lot more people here who might not otherwise be able to participate. So, delighted to introduce the moderator of this event. Husein Cumber is the Chief Strategy Officer for Florida East Coast Industries. He's responsible for guiding major capital projects from conception through development. One of those, Brightline, is the first privately owned and operated intercity passenger rail system in the US in over 100 years. Another is Fortress Transportation and Infrastructure, where Husein is involved with several development efforts at terminals in New Jersey, Texas, and Ohio. And at New Fortress Energy, Husein works with the business development team focused on the delivery of liquid natural gas to domestic and foreign markets. From 2005 to 2009, Husein served as an assistant to the Secretary for Policy and as Deputy Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Transportation. Husein is a graduate of Duke University, where he earned a bachelor's degree in U.S. national security. So Husein, I'm now going to pass along the mic to you, and you can feel free to take it from here.
Perfect. Thank you, Brian. Really appreciate that. And I want to welcome everybody to this virtual meeting. Obviously, we would have all loved to be on campus today, but I do want to stress one thing. My son was going to be up there with us this weekend because he hadn't seen Duke in a while, but he thought it would be funny to send me all the different Zoom mishaps that have happened and videos. And so I just want to remind what Brian mentioned, which is this is being recorded. So just have that in mind as we, as we go through the next hour and a half. What I wanted to do was go around, give the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. Then we're going to go through some initial panel discussion, and then we're going to leave it open for the last 25 minutes or so in order to get to some Q&A. And so I will go ahead and start off by saying that Lisa Poger was supposed to join us today. She apologizes for the last minute cancellation, but she has come under the weather. She assures us it is not coronavirus related, but was under the weather and couldn't join us. And so Nathan, I'm going to start with you, and if you wouldn't mind going ahead and introducing yourself. And then once Nathan is done, Ben and Daniel, if you wouldn't mind following Nathan.
Great, thanks Husein. Yeah, my name is Nathan Hsieh. I graduated from Duke University undergrad back in 2014, where I studied math and religion, and I also engaged a lot with the Energy Initiative as I helped Daniel to start up the Energy Club for the undergrads. After I graduated, decided to take a bit of an alternative path and took this great opportunity to go live and work overseas with this fellowship program called Princeton Asia for 3 years. I worked in the financial services in outer Mongolia, and at the same time started up a small social enterprise called Smart Air Mongolia that focuses on providing indoor air at the cheapest possible cost. Returned to the US in September 2018, and where I decided I wanted to re-engage in the clean energy side of things. Got involved at the Mobility House, where I work as a project lead for for the Mobility House, where we basically provide charging infrastructure for fleets of electric vehicles and a managed charging solution. The company is primarily based in Europe, but we've been starting up the office here for the last year and a half or so. Yeah, and with that, I'll turn it over to Ben.
Hi guys, this is Ben Rogers. Can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, great. Well, look, I greatly appreciate you guys including me on this. It's a real pleasure. I'm a little trying to adjust here. I've been in the energy space for mid-90s, focused mostly on regulated and merchant utilities. I was also a banker at Goldman Sachs, covering the utility space for a long time. I left Goldman. I co-founded a firm called Broadscale Group that helps startups grow their business with corporates, as well as corporates scaling up startups. I've been focused on kind of the intersection of startups and corporates for a little over 10 years now, and very much focused on how to scale up the startups as quickly as possible with the corporates, de-risk, raise capital for these startups. I'm currently a venture partner at Braemar Energy Ventures in New York City, but also spend a lot of my time creating a new business with Duke Energy focused on fleet electrification.
Great, and this is Daniel Ketyer. I'll introduce myself now. I am currently at d.light, an off-grid solar energy firm based out of Nairobi, but I'm back in the States safely now. I had to do a little emergency evacuation last week, but I'm back. Spent past 3.5 years in New York City with Deloitte Consulting in our mergers and acquisitions practice, advising auto OEMs, advising auto suppliers, advising oil and gas companies that are trying to scenario plan for the future of mobility. And on the side of that, I was the lead of our future of mobility community. So I was the chief of staff for our group that's focused on thought leadership around the future of mobility and transportation. Graduated from Duke in 2016, studied public policy. With Nathan, we started up the Undergraduate Energy Club and worked pretty closely with the Energy Initiative. I've been to more of these power lunches or these events that we have, probably more than I could count. And it's good to be on the other side of the table and sharing some of my learnings with you guys.
Thank you. So we've got a super panel, and I'd love to just kind of jump into it. And we obviously are living in a very interesting time right now. And before we started with this kind of downturn, we had a lot of disruption going on in the energy sector, in the transportation sector, in the healthcare sector, and now we've got a lot of economic dislocation taking place in the market. So I want to start with asking all the panelists, when you look at the dislocation occurring, especially with the price of oil, with COVID-19 impacting the future of transportation, talk to us a little bit about which companies stand to benefit, which ones are probably going to be the more challenged moving forward as we come out of this. And what I'll do is, Nathan, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go in the same order, and then give Ben and Daniel an opportunity to answer as well.
Sure, sounds good. Thanks, Husein. I definitely think a lot of the automotive, the large automotive manufacturers are going to get hit. I think a lot of them are having to shut down their manufacturing right now, and they're stuck with a pretty significant wage bill. We work personally very closely with the German automotive manufacturers, and it's definitely been the case. Fortunately, over there, they've got some pretty progressive social structures such that the government is picking up portions of the wage bill. So they're trying to keep employment relatively high. In general, though, I do think public transportation is going to see a lot less ridership over the next few months. I just think a lot of things are going to go on pause, and that might remain for a bit longer than the actual shelter-in-place policies will go for. I think probably see a lot less consumption in terms of new vehicle purchases, and it's going to take time to boost consumer confidence to get people going to the point where they're comfortable making big purchases like cars again. I definitely think ride-sharing companies that have already been struggling to turn profitable will get hit as well in this scenario. And yeah, I'll turn it over to Ben now.
Oh, hey, it's Ben. Yeah, that's a great question, because I think you've got a lot of different competing forces here. I mean, climate change doesn't go away with all this stuff. It's still a main issue. I think one of the key issues is look at the price of crude oil. The price of crude is going to be, I think, below $30 for quite some time, and that's going to have a major impact on the oil patch here in the United States. But it's a huge benefit it's an input cost, and so it's a huge benefit for a lot of industrial firms. But it's also a benefit for consumers who are driving. With crude below $30, gasoline is going to be below $1.50 on average, and so I think they're going to benefit quite a bit. From the perspective of what we're focused on around electrification of transportation, I think the number in a lot of total cost of ownership models, so TCO models, or still, they average $2 for gasoline when you think about where the savings are. And so I think I would agree. I think the benefits will be, delivery companies will see higher volume. I think Ford and GM and Chrysler and those guys are going to be challenged in the short term, because who wants to go out and buy a car right now? I think ride sharing is also impacted. I think the fleet management companies have to rechange their model. Fleet management companies being like Penske, Ryder, those type of companies, because a lot of their revenues comes from the maintenance of internal combustion engines. If you switch to all electric, that business kind of goes away for them. So they're going to have to remake themselves into how to manage batteries, secondary life of batteries. V2G type technologies are going to come down the road. And so I think those type of companies are going to benefit quite a bit as we make this transition from internal combustion to all electric delivery trucks.
Yeah, and I think the one question that I have is, who's going to survive? Which of these small companies are going to survive? We just saw over the weekend, Bird, micromobility firm, laid off about 30% of their employees. We're seeing Lime and some of the other micromobility firms that are not yet profitable, that are having to make significant cuts. So what we're seeing is that there are going to be some of these new innovative companies that just aren't going to survive, another 3 or 6 months of zero cash flow or low cash flow. So I think short term, it's going to be very disruptive to the mobility space. Long term, I worry that it's going to cause cause folks to second guess going into and working at one of these smaller startups. And I think it just underscores, when I came out of undergrad in 2016, there was no shortage of really cool places you could go work. Some of them weren't profitable yet. Didn't really matter. You could still make a lot of money. You could still do cool work. I think this is just going to signal that the market's it's very risky. And I think there are going to be some companies that don't survive, and it's going to push some talent to maybe, I guess, more risk-averse types of careers or risk-averse types of jobs, which I think is overall going to be a bad thing for innovation broadly. That's one point I make. The second point, I think there's a lot of talk about airlines, air travel. Is that going to recover? I personally believe that it won't recover. I believe that we're starting to see, we're getting comfortable working remotely. We're starting to, at least from a business travel standpoint, we're starting to see that we can be close to, if not more productive if we don't have to travel around the world, at least in some of our professions. And I think I think some of these behaviors, some of these working from home and some of these other behaviors are going to be sticky coming out of this downturn. And I think that's going to be very, very bad for airlines and some of these long distance personal travel. I think goods will, goods are not going to be affected. We need food, we need goods, but I think personal air travel is not going to be the same.
That's an interesting perspective. So let's switch over to the future of electric mobility. So notwithstanding the challenges of the present moment, what's your assessment of the future of electric mobility? And so let's reverse it this time. We'll start with Ben and then go to Daniel and Nathan.
Hey, it's Ben. Yeah, I think what we're focused on our business, just to kind of be clear, is we think last mile delivery, we think transit buses, electric school buses, all of those should be electric because they have a pattern where they go out every single day, they do the same exact route, they go on average 55 miles a day, and then they come back to a depot and they sit at the depot for 8 to 10 hours a night. And so our view of the world is that segment of the marketplace should be all electric because it's very manageable from a battery perspective. And so, whether it's last mile delivery, FedEx, Amazon, UPS, DHL, all those trucks, as well as USPS, all those, so that's class 3 to class 6 type trucks should all be electric because it's very manageable, and the cost of switching over to all electric from internal combustion engine is fairly economic. And battery prices will continue to come down for another 50% over the next 4 or 5 years or so. So we think that part of the market is very attractive for all electric transportation because of the reasons I just mentioned. But also it goes back to the economics, the total cost of ownership, which a lot of these companies talk about, which is their TCO analysis. Is going to get, the returns are going to get better as battery costs continue to decline, and the overall performance of these last mile delivery trucks get better. So I think, even under this kind of adverse condition economically, as well as a low oil price environment, I do think you're going to see many more companies switch over to all electric delivery and transportation, mostly because a lot of their benefits come from the reduction of maintenance of internal combustion engines. So, when you're talking about TCO savings, 75% of the savings comes from a reduction of maintenance costs versus 25%, which is a reduction in electricity costs. And so we think it's going to continue to grow quite a bit.
So Ben, let me ask you a quick follow-up to that is, everyone has talked about, they've kind of invoked GM, Ford, kind of the legacy U.S. car makers. Are they doing enough to stay relevant long-term if this electric mobility shift is happening in the industry?
A great question. I think in some subsectors they are. Like Ford has a truck called the Transit, the Ford Transit, and they can turn that into an e-transit truck very quickly. Mary Barra, the CEO of GM, just announced a $20 billion initiative on electrification. A lot of that is focused on delivery. They're not as far ahead as Ford on delivery, but they certainly want to catch up. Now, all of this has just occurred here in the last couple months, I think delays some of this a little bit. But, over in Europe, there's a lot of activity going on with Daimler with their e-Sprinter van. Daimler owns Freightliner. So the Class 8 trucks are starting to go all electric faster than people have realized. And so again, it goes back to maintenance costs. I think when you reduce when you go all electric, you dramatically reduce your maintenance costs, and it's significant over a period of 10 to 15 years.
Great. Daniel?
Yeah, I'd like to underscore Ben's point about maintenance. So when we think about future of mobility at Deloitte, we're thinking shared electric autonomous mobility. SEAM is the term that we've been using. And when you think about autonomous mobility and when you think about ride sharing and shared mobility, what you start seeing is that these vehicles are traveling many more miles than they previously had. When you're thinking an autonomous mobility future, you're going to see potentially tons more vehicle miles traveled, and you'll see the maintenance benefits will start to add up pretty significantly. If you can reduce your maintenance costs by 75%, I mean that's by going electric. That's significant. Or I think Ben's point was 75% of the savings were maintenance. But point is, maintenance is a huge savings there with electric. The way I'm thinking about it though, so I've done a good amount of work with oil majors in the U.S. who are thinking about what is the long-term decline in oil demand going to do to our business, where you see today about 2/3 of oil ends up going towards transportation. That ends up being the end use of oil. And what the oil majors are thinking is, is it inevitable that we're in an electric mobility future, or is it potentially hydrogen, or is it potentially an end state where we can continue to have internal combustion engines in some use cases and plug-in hybrids in others and battery electric in others? So I think the magnitude of electric vehicle penetration is up for debate, and some of the most influential stakeholders in the space certainly do not want significant electric vehicle penetration because it fundamentally threatens their business. So that's something that I'm paying attention to is who is what is this magnitude of electric vehicle penetration and what is the pace, how quickly we get there.
Great. Nathan, as you kind of tackle this question, can you think about it from the perspective of, we talk about how vehicles and, and other end uses will be more energy efficient, energy friendly, but go back to how do we end up generating the electricity needed in a way that actually is also responsible as well?
Sure, of course. That's something that we are very focused on here at the Mobility House. So our sort of business model is fundamentally based off of the fact that we think batteries are going to be a big part of that responsible mix of how the future fleet is powered. We think that batteries will be a big part of the solution to the renewable integration problem. And by that, I refer to, the duck curve economics of variable resources. I definitely think that, so our business model is based off of the notion of trying to integrate vehicle batteries with the grid. So the batteries can provide grid services like frequency regulation, other behind the meter services like participating demand response programs, peak shaving. That's sort of fundamentally what the business is based off of. I do, sort of stepping back from a personal perspective, still believe that there needs to be base load at the end of the day. I think natural gas was a step in the right direction in that you get much less carbon per kilowatt hour, but it's still carbon based. This may be a relatively unpopular opinion, but I do think the only carbon free sort of baseload out there is nuclear, but I think the political feasibility of that might be doubtful. Just given what we've seen over the last several decades. But I just bring it up in that I sort of urge people to think about what the trade-off they want there is. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Ben, I'm gonna go back to you. I want to talk a little bit about the big industry players right now and what's happening with them, and talk to us a little bit about Tesla, because it seems to be the question and the company that seems to dominate the conversation. You know, they're at $900 stock price before the virus kind of hit the world economy. Where are they 5, 10, 20 years from now? And is that why the legacy companies are seeing themselves in this catch-up mode? Is, they see the popularity of the company and the trajectory it's on right now?
Yeah, I think Tesla is really interesting from a valuation perspective. It's hard to get people focused on Tesla as just when they think about the volume that they produce versus GM and Ford. It's hard for them to get their arms around the valuation. But I think the secret sauce really is the time and effort that Elon has spent on the battery and the software. He is so far ahead of GM and Ford and Chrysler in that area. I think he's going to keep that kind of that learning curve for many, many years. And so I think the stock goes back up again to where it was before this crisis. I think he's going to certainly improve on battery and the software. But I think the main differential is, again, kind of the focus that he's had on the battery and the software. It's really it's an impressive car from a performance perspective. It's better than any other car out there. And I think all the other companies that are out there are very concerned about it because they do find themselves so far behind where he is. And he's doing things to make the company more integrated with regards to solar. He's purchased the solar company. He has a lot of charging stations, and so he's trying to get more and more integrated with fleet electrification and overall electrification by becoming more integrated. So I think to answer your question, I think the stock is higher. It goes back up into the 900 range. I think he keeps his lead over the other companies for the next 5, 6 years or so. Battery prices are only going to come down over the next 5 years based off of Bloomberg New Energy Finance projections. And so his cars are only going to get more economic. That would help, obviously, his margins. And so I just think that the key here is really all the time and attention he has on the battery and the software.
Super. Nathan, I'm going to switch back to you for a second. We were talking a little bit about the generation infrastructure that has to be put in place. So I'm going to take it to the other end, which is when Tesla started, they wanted this completely closed end system. They have their superchargers just for their vehicles. Talk to us a little bit about who is going to build out the charging infrastructure? Who's going to be is this a winner takes all type scenario where there are going to be 2, 3 big players? And then how does that affect the big, gas companies today? So your ExxonMobil, Chevron's, BP that have spent billions of dollars with their, franchise owners building an infrastructure out throughout the country for, gasoline powered vehicles.
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's a really fantastic question, and one that we are thinking about very closely here at the Mobility House. We've talked to a lot of different folks who are trying to get to know the space and see what pieces they might be able to pick off for themselves. That's a range of banks, utilities, OEMs, oil and gas, sort of really everyone across the board that sees that there's an opportunity to invest in infrastructure and perhaps get some sort of return there, some sort of long-term repetitive cash flow. We're sort of under the impression, based on all the different folks we've talked to, that really the utilities are best positioned to take most of it. I think there's a couple different ways you can think of it. One, I think they have a huge comparative advantage in terms of their balance sheet. Fundamentally, what we've seen is they're looking for a repayment period on the timescale that the folks in the private equity world just couldn't even think on. They they know infrastructure and they know what it's like to own and operate it. So we think that that will be a big, they will take a big portion of the pie there. We also think that oil and gas definitely have the balance sheets to pick up the assets that they need as the industry develops, but we've definitely seen that they're not really trying to be too proactive or cutting edge on taking that risk and moving the needle forward there. But yeah, so I definitely say utilities are really well positioned to take a good piece, and oil and gas will sort of hover around, observe, and see what the winners will be that they can try to acquire.
So Daniel, just one kind of follow up to that. So what happens to all the ancillary support companies that have developed over the past decade? So call it the Jiffy Lubes of the industry. How do they stay relevant? How do they pivot their business model? Or are they going to be just overtaken by the disruption that's occurring?
Yeah, I think the question is, what is the pace of the disruption? How quickly is the disruption going to come? And I think one of the things with a company like a Jiffy Lube is they're going to need to look at how to diversify, and they're going to need to look at where these companies are making investments. So I know, I've done a lot of work with the oil majors. The way that most of these oil majors are structured today is they have an upstream business which focuses on extraction of resources. They have a downstream business which focuses more on retail. And there's been a shift from resources in upstream to resources in downstream, but the focus has been more in petrochemicals and more in plastics rather than, there's been more investment in those types of assets rather than in the retail stations, and the retail stations which would be complementary with some of the lubricants retailers like a Jiffy Lube. And so I think you're starting to see the big players in the space start to position the pieces, but in a way that is really not prepared for a retail network where it's going to be electric focused. I think most of these players, I think even Jiffy Lube, or I think even the OEMs, frankly, think that the shift towards electric mobility is going to take place over decades and not necessarily years. I think many of us who sit closer to the technologies and the more innovative players, and we read up, on the Tesla earnings releases, and we see the exciting things that are happening. We think that this is months, if not years, rather than decades. So I think, I guess to answer your question, I think yes, they're in trouble, but they don't think that they're in trouble for the time being. They think this will happen in 2040, 2050, 2060, and they'll have time to reposition their assets accordingly.
Taxi companies thought the same thing, so we'll see how that goes. I want to switch a little bit to supply chain, and obviously with China being in the news, the last couple of years, the trade wars, and now with the coronavirus, I think the Americans are starting to realize the dependency we have, whether it's been the pharmaceutical industry, whether it's components going into defense weapons that we manufacture here, rare earth materials, items like that. So when we think of batteries that we need, specifically the lithium-ion batteries, whether it's for Tesla or other vehicles that come, and then just battery storage in general. So 97% of the lithium-ion is based in Asia, China, Korea, and Japan. So Ben, I want to start with you. How does current events affect our ability to get our hands on the materials that are needed in order to be able to create a clean energy environment?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because I think a lot of people are starting to think about, should we bring back more production to the U.S. With all that's going on over in Asia? The biggest players are over there. I mean, Panasonic, Samsung, LG Chem, CATL, they are by far the biggest players in lithium-ion cylindrical cells. And so I think that's where we have to think about, how do we source those resources, and make sure that we have the right, trading policies with those companies, because it is going to be very challenging when we see this growth. We know this growth is going to happen in electrification of transportation. And we're going to, obviously, in the next several years, 10 years, 20 years, still be relying on lithium. Now, but there's a lot of work being done on other materials, substituting cobalt, substituting magnesium. How does zinc play a role in transportation for batteries? So that innovation doesn't go away, and I think we need to encourage it even more, because we can't be relying on lithium ion coming from a certain sector of the world, unless we have really good trading policies with these companies in these countries. And so I think it's going to be vital to make sure that we have the right access to these materials going forward, which just necessitates making sure that we have a good relationships with all these countries across the board where they have these materials.
Daniel, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the cobalt question is the big question right now. Is what is the future of the lithium-ion battery going to be? Is it going to be more cobalt intensive? Is it going to be more nickel intensive? Right now, about 75% of all cobalt in the world is produced out of the Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa, where China has made very significant direct investments in that sector, and has ownership by proxy of the assets in DRC. So that obviously has significant concerns for U.S. national security and for, I think for the future of mobility in the U.S., but more broadly is, are we going to be so dependent on a single source, a single material to play a role in our transportation system? So what you've actually been seeing is Tesla and a few others begin to experiment with, can we reduce our cobalt usage in our batteries? Can we shift towards more nickel focused and start to look at other types of battery chemistries? The downside is that cobalt is very energy intensive or energy dense, and that's part of the reason why electric vehicle ranges are so high and have been able to get as high as they are today, because you're able to use some of these materials like cobalt. But that's something to pay attention to in the next few years, few months, is what are the innovations in battery chemistry, and how does that impact the global game in terms of who has the resources and who has the power and who influences the supply chain.
Super. Nathan, do you want to add some?
It's a fantastic question, and it's frankly it's a tough one, as I think it relies really heavily on our foreign policy standpoint, which obviously stems from our leadership and administration, and the application of how they use policy to shape trade, depending and the different forms it can take, whether that's something like the TPP or a trade war. So it's a tough one. I do think you can approach it from a couple of different standpoints. One, you can look at trying to reduce dependency by improving, by looking into R&D for good battery and charging technologies, higher energy density, better standardization across charging platforms. I think things like that will sort of allow us to alleviate our dependency, but fundamentally, unless the core technology itself shifts away, or we can figure out a way to build up manufacturing and production domestically. It's going to be a tough balance to play that certainly has a wide array of implications.
Super. So I'm going to pick up a little bit on your on the political identification that you mentioned with respect to trade wars and trade policy. So the regulatory climate obviously affects our ability to be able to not only create a climate where people are willing to take the risk to look at new technologies, but also, affects the financial capability of a lot of these companies being able to, address the challenges at hand. So I want to ask this question kind of twofold. One is, what are some of these regulatory barriers facing the industry? And number two, knowing there's a lot of discussion right now of a stimulus 4 bill that may focus a lot on transportation infrastructure, what would you recommend policy makers think about in stimulus 4? And are those, a direct result to help the regulatory framework, or are there larger policy issues that need to be debated right now? So Ben, let's start with you, and then we'll let Nathan and Daniel go after.
Yeah, and let me just ask a quick question on from a regulatory perspective. Are you referring to just regulations around all electric transportation, or could you just be a little bit clearer from a regulatory perspective?
Yeah, sure. So regulatory issues, everything from autonomous vehicles to being able to have charging infrastructure deployed, where you don't have county by county specific regulations or state by state regulations. You have a lot of players that want to come in and not be subject to a patchwork of regulations, but at the same time, at the federal level, sometimes there isn't a feeling that you want to be able to pick winners and losers, but you end up getting a patchwork of investments that take place, but you also don't have a lot of people that are willing to invest a lot of money, not knowing if they're going to be subject to different regulations as they continue to expand. It makes it harder for investors to want to back a company when you don't know the scalability of that venture.
Got it. No, that's helpful. Yeah, I think there's two worlds here. One is kind of the startups that are focused on this space, and then there's the larger companies who are the more the incumbents who are in this space. I think and then there's also regional issues too. Like California always leads from an environmental perspective or reduction of carbon perspective with their policies and their incentives. So a lot of work around electrification of transportation is done out in California first because they have much larger incentives. We've got to think beyond that, because we just can't run a business on incentives. It has to work in every state across the country. And so, all the conversations that we're having with last mile delivery companies is really centered around not regulations, but economics. And so, if the economics make sense in terms of the total cost of ownership, if it's better under an all electric scenario, and it's more affordable than diesel trucks, they will make that switch. Because again, the benefits are reduced maintenance costs, reduced fuel costs will outweigh any premium that you have to pay for all electric trucks. And so we think it's less, the questions we're hearing is less of a regulatory perspective, but more about economic perspective. And so a lot of these guys are running their quote TCO models to better understand whether an electric school bus may cost $300,000 and the diesel bus of a bus costs $115,000. How do you make that gap work when the battery is still 50% of the bus's cost? And so the companies that we're talking to, UPS, FedEx, Amazon, they're not focused on regulatory. They're focused more on economics, whether this is the right economic decision, what's the payback period for making the switch. And then it's also how much carbon are we reducing? And so you can really look at and calculate very quickly what how much carbon you're reducing by making this switch. And so, you know, I know I'm not answering your question with regards to regulatory issues, but what we're hearing from a lot of the transit agencies and school bus operators in last mile delivery is more about an economic decision than a regulatory decision. I do think from a regulatory perspective or policy issue, I think price of carbon is going to come back on the table, because the stimulus bills that are 2.2 trillion and higher, we're going to need a way to pay some of that back. And I actually do think, you know, a bipartisan approach to a carbon price is going to come down the pike here soon. And some of that will be helping the economic numbers for these companies to switch over to all electric and make that decision a lot faster.
Great. So Nathan, let me add a little more context to the question before we switch to you. So, you know, we are a country where our infrastructure is built using the gas tax. And everything we've talked about today leads to the conclusion that the Highway Trust Fund would actually get reduced. So how do we, from a federal policy perspective and even a state policy perspective, continue to have the dollars needed to invest in the infrastructure? Because whatever technology wins, we still need the infrastructure in order to be able to get the goods from, you know, whether coming in from a port, whether being manufactured here, to the actual consumer.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. I did want to take that question in terms of the infrastructure direction, just because you know, what we're finding working with fleet managers is that, you know, people aren't used to being responsible to own these assets in their business model. You know, the charging infrastructure assets. You know, it's not, most fleet managers don't have to put in the gas pumps at their sites. You know, that's really elsewhere. So it's a really important question that needs to be addressed, and I think a lot of it will stem from some sort of incentive program. Where exactly that comes from, whether it be a carbon tax, or I think a good example is California's cap and trade model, in terms of trying to figure out a way to sustainably allocate funding towards infrastructure. In California, the cap and trade model has successfully, from I think last year on, been able to allocate about $500 million towards clean air, clean mobility incentives. So I think that's a good model to draw from. I'm not entirely sure in terms of what's politically feasible, but I definitely think that's the model to look towards.
Great. Daniel, anything to add?
Yeah, I would say, so when I was at Duke, you know, 2012 to 2016, our head of innovation and entrepreneurship there, Eric Toon, had come over from ARPA-E. He was I believe one of the founding directors of ARPA-E, which is essentially the early stage lab to market commercialization arm of the Department of Energy. And I think that is a model that you know, blew up under the Obama administration as a way to bridge the gap from these early stage technologies that maybe aren't economically feasible right now, but could be in a few years as costs start to come down and as states start to offer more favorable incentives, like you see in California. So I think more programs like ARPA-E, which obviously has not investments in ARPA-E have not increased under this administration. So I think things like that that's something that you know, those types of allocations within the federal budget, that's something that you know, the executive branch can do. I think ideally a carbon tax, I think we all agree that some price on carbon, whether it's a carbon tax or cap and trade, would make this whole transition to clean energy and to shared electric autonomous mobility. It would just make that transition more seamless and less painful for everyone involved. And I'm less bullish on that passing in the next few years, but I think from an executive standpoint, I would say make more investments in these early stage technologies and charging and electric battery chemistry, things like that. And that's something that ARPA-E has done.
Super. So just kind of a heads up to those that are on the virtual meeting. A couple more questions we're going to ask, then we're going to open it up, and we'll have Brian Cohen ask some questions that are coming in from folks in the meeting. What I would also ask is, I know we've got a lot of utility leaders and other experts on the meeting. And if you wouldn't mind giving any of your advice in the chat box, that would be appreciated and super helpful. So last couple questions for the group. I'm going to start with a little more of a fun one. So there are a lot of Duke students or recent graduates on the meeting or in the meeting, and would love to hear, one or two companies that aren't household names that each one of you have come across in your workplace, that if you were aspiring to go into the industry and be part of the disruption that's taking place today, these would be a couple companies that if you were a Duke student today, you would, you'd kind of want to go look at and join them. So Ben, I'm going to start with you on that.
Actually, I would highlight my fellow panelists company, the Mobility House. We've been talking to the executive management there. They've done a lot of great work over in Europe with regards to secondary life of batteries, as well as vehicle to grid technologies. It's also called VGI. And so I think that's going to be, if you think about, again, these three main areas of last mile delivery, transit buses and school buses, a lot of the work that they're doing replaces the work that's being done by the Penske's, the Riders of the world, because right now what they do is maintenance on the engine and everything associated with the engine. That's all going to be replaced by how you manage the battery. And, so you talked about Jiffy Lube earlier, if you don't have that oil there, that business kind of goes away. And so everything is now centered around managing the energy, which is the battery. And so I think the work that Mobility House is doing over in Europe, we're talking to them about doing work here in the US. I think that's in all kind of services and solutions around how you manage that battery from when it first goes into the truck into its secondary life and most likely being used on the grid. I think is going to be an enormous area of opportunity for startups.
Thanks very much, Ben. I was going to say the Mobility House as well, but it sounds better coming from you than from me. I think I'll just comment on a couple. They're not going to necessarily be not household names, but they are the general areas where I think the most interesting movements are happening in the electrification space in general. I mean, I definitely think Tesla is leading the way in terms of especially the LDV market, in that they have the largest volume and production capacity of electric vehicles right now. That being said, once the resources of the large automotive OEMs realigns, I think it's going to be, they are going to pick up a good bit of market share just because they have the workforce, the resources, the manufacturing capacity right now to produce an amount of vehicles that I don't think Tesla will be able to get to. The other area, which I think is very important to look out for, that hasn't really gotten much of a comment on so far is the Chinese automotive manufacturers. They're very much so, they've been very dominant in developing markets with some sales in Europe, but they are very quietly taking a huge amount of market share throughout the world, in especially the electric bus space. that being BYD, especially. That being said, I'm not sure if if those companies will play in Europe and the US, and that we've seen at least this is my, I think, Husein, you might be able to comment better on this, but I think BYD was recently banned from participating or receiving any money from federal grants. So that they may not be able to do that much business here, but I definitely think they're an interesting group of companies to look out for in terms of how things will develop over the next few years.
Great. Daniel?
Yeah. So I may be biased because I joined Deloitte coming out of undergrad. I joined a pretty huge firm, but I think there's a lot of value to joining a bigger player in the industry. Ben mentioned LG Chem, Panasonic, Samsung, some of the biggest players in the battery world. I think finding a rotational program or a role at an entry level role at a firm like that, where you can wear a bunch of different hats and see the world from a finance standpoint, from a policy standpoint, from an engineering standpoint. I think doing a few years in a program like that would be incredibly valuable. You'll start to see who the emerging players in the space are, who the emerging technologies are, and I think you'll have a good sense of the niche that you potentially want to go into. So that's I think with Deloitte, I think there's a lot of people there are pros and cons with consulting. There's a lot of people have opinions about whether going into consulting is the right thing, because it seems like everyone at Duke undergrad is trying to get a job at McKinsey or Deloitte or Bain, and I think there is a ton of value if you do it for a couple of years. You see what the world's like, and then you find the niche that you want to go into. So that's my advice.
Super. Thank you, panelists. We're now going to switch. I'm going to let Brian, who's been collecting questions coming in, to go ahead and ask some from the audience.
All right. Thanks, Husein, and thanks to all the panelists for a great discussion so far. I think I'll start by moving us back to where we started the outset of the conversation. Husein, you noted that we've got a number of utility experts in the digital audience here. And so I'm going to start with a question from Devesh Gupta. Devesh has a great title. He's Director of Strategy for the Utility of the Future for Baltimore Gas and Electric. And he's also a graduate of Duke Law. And Devesh writes, "We're seeing major emissions reductions around the globe in urban environments, for example, in Los Angeles, due to the reduction in vehicles and transit vehicles on the roads during this pandemic response. How will this data point affect views and investment in electrification in the transportation sector once we're through this challenging time?"
So who from the panel wants to take that?
I'll take it. I'll take a stab at it. I did, yeah. Like the evidence is clear when you look at these like heat maps and you show there's no cars on the road and there's no emissions. That's very clear. But I think that's kind of what you're going to see when you go all electric. The transit buses and the school buses and last mile delivery. From that perspective, as well as on the consumer side. And so I think it's, the answer coming from a utility, BG&E, a subsidiary of Exelon. I think utilities play a great role in helping to transition this industry to all electric because they manage electrons on the grid. Electrons are flowing through the batteries. Electrons are flowing through the charging stations. The charging stations are connected to the grid, and the trucks and buses are connected to the charging stations. And so, I think it's utilities are in a very nice place to help accelerate this transition to all electric, and their communities are only going to benefit from a health and wellness perspective as they transition these buses and trucks and cars to all electric. And you're going to continue to see those aerial views of cities and towns and counties where they have less atmospheric emissions. And so, you know, utilities 100 years ago used to own the town's transportation systems. And so they were integrated that way. I think you're going to see a lot of utilities, you know, want to partner with the transportation companies so that they can help those companies make this switch faster, so that you can see these results that impact their customers, the utility customers, in their communities with less emissions.
Great, Brian. We'll go back to you for another question. And I should mention to folks in the meeting that Brian is on staff at the Energy Initiative, so that's why he's been collecting all these questions.
Thank you very much, Husein. And I thought I'd move on to a finance question. We had an audience member named Becca W, whose question contains a great point about finance. And I apologize, Becca, I wasn't able to find your title in the chat, but Becca's question reads, I'm noting that most of this conversation has focused on private sector action in delivery, fleets, and personal vehicles. With so much mobility falling to state and local agencies, how can we increase coordination between sectors like utilities, transit agencies, and school districts? For transit districts in particular, the maintenance budget is usually separate from procurement and can't normally be blurred, so the maintenance savings may not get them over the initial cost delta between an electric and conventional diesel bus.
Daniel, I'm going to give you that one.
Yeah. So I think obviously private-public partnerships are going to be very important. I think, you know, as someone who has lived in New York for the past 3.5 years, one of the things that I've been following that I've been particularly interested in has been how the MTA and how New York City Transit has seemingly improved significantly in just a couple of years. You know, we went from having massive delays to having most of the trains running on time, and I think a lot of that had to do with the leadership in the public sector. But it also, one of the things that we saw in New York was some of these startup incubators that were focused on transit tech. And so I know I'm speaking more on transit rather than on like the bus fleets, but I think there are these ideas that you used to just see out of Silicon Valley, out of Y Combinator, where you'd have these 12-week, 16-week incubator programs or accelerator programs where you could apply with a startup idea and get some advice and get some funding, and then and try to turn it into a business. And now you're seeing in New York, you can do the same thing with transit tech. In Hawaii, Hawaii is one of the first examples with the Elemental Accelerator in Hawaii, where you can apply with an early stage idea, and it's kind of a public-private partnership type of model. So I think those are the models that seem like they work, and I think the good news is that there are more and more cities and states, governments that are using incubator and accelerator models as a way to drive innovation and more investment in the public sector.
Great. Ben or Nathan, you have anything to add to that?
I'll add one thing quickly, in that one thing that we've definitely seen, I'm just trying to think of ways in terms of how to increase, as you mentioned, that sort of public-private partnerships, those public-private partnerships. One thing I think we've definitely seen, especially with fleet managers, and I refer to fleet managers generally as also inclusive of that public transit space. So bus operators, you know, I think there's definitely a lack of understanding at the moment in terms of what the operational implications are of electrification. You know, these fleet managers understand how their current fleet operates. They understand engines, they get their duty cycles, they know the maintenance schedules. But with all that changing with this new electric business model, they also now need to get geared up in terms of knowing infrastructure, and that goes back to the very basics of what we learned in energy and environment at the very start of the difference between a kilowatt and a kilowatt hour. So I definitely think there's a big educational component that can help to facilitate that transition as well. In that those are the sorts of questions that we've had to answer a lot, bringing together both fleet and facilities managers.
Super.
And so speaking of facilitating transitions, Nathan, I think your point about lack of understanding of the implications of electrification is a good one. And we've got a question from current graduate student Liz Chanot, who asks, what organizations should and what organizations are currently working the most on the education and marketing of non-internal combustion engine vehicles? Liz notes, my impression is that individuals and fleet managers are underinformed, and she notes that last summer she attended a clean transportation fleet-related conference and was very surprised to find a number of folks marketing fossil fuel-related products.
Ben, you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, from the utilities perspective, a lot of research is being done at the Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, which is funded by the 44 investor-owned utilities across the country. I think also the trade group, the Edison Electric Institute, EEI, is also an organization that puts out a lot of quality work around electrification of transportation. And so I think various DOE labs, I know that Sandia is doing a lot of work in this area as well. But I would highlight that EPRI and EEI are putting out a lot of quality information around the impacts to customers as they go electric, as well as impacts to communities as the big fleet companies start to go all electric.
Daniel and Nathan, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Again, maybe biased because I worked for 3.5 years in consulting, but whenever I'm looking for, what are the leading edge thoughts around electrification or the future of mobility or anything in that space, the first places I'll go will be the McKinsey or the big consulting firms that are putting out pretty regular thought pieces on what they think the future is going to look like, and relatively progressive views as well. I know Deloitte, we put out a piece that we're saying the break even where we think an electric vehicle is going to be cost competitive with the internal combustion engine vehicle is in 2022. So so it's things that are like, it's not like, hey, this is like a very conservative organization that's kind of behind the times. It's like a lot of these consulting firms are thinking about how to prepare for this future and are doing a lot of the research and seeing it play out when in engagements with different clients.
I definitely sorry about that. I definitely support that, in that I think a lot of the most marketable piece of information that we've come across have definitely been produced by a lot of the big consulting firms. They are pretty good about producing easily digestible white papers on this sort of material. That's definitely the case. I don't think I've got any other cutting edge resources that I think are widely consumable.
Great. And Brian, before you go to the next question, I know one of the questions you asked was from Devesh Gupta from Baltimore Gas and Electric, and I think Devesh had a couple thoughts on this. So if you can hear us, Devesh, go ahead and give us your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm happy to on this question. Another organization that certainly a lot of the utilities rely on is the Smart Electric Power Alliance as well. If they put out a couple of white papers in this space, and I'd echo those thoughts on the consulting companies as well. I think just this morning one came across my desk from Navigant that started pouring through. Just generally, I think to the last question, in thinking about public-private partnerships, we certainly support that. There's so much that's going on in the private industry that we have to leverage from a utility perspective. But for us, I would say a huge piece of the puzzle for us is that policy and regulation piece of it. Having policymakers that are engaged, that understand the issues, and that are willing to try some different things. It is one of the frustrating parts about this pandemic response. In Maryland, for instance, we had a bunch of legislation that was teed up to go, so at least the conversation would be happening. And of course, with the legislature wrapping up early, all those things are pushed until the fall, and a lot will have changed by then, right? In terms of appetites for what legislators want to deal with. We're hoping that climate change and electrification of transportation is still top of mind. But that is a critical piece of it. I think in Virginia, just to the south of us, you saw Dominion also pushing quite a bit of legislation around electric buses, electrification, using those resources as a grid support and providing some sort of financial help to school districts to be able to do that. So it allowed for a little bit of the public-private utility partnership to happen. That kind of legislation would. But you need regulators and legislators that are willing to have that conversation.
Great, thank you. Brian, we probably have time for 2 more questions, so we'll go back to you.
Okay. Well, I'll just sort of end with a couple of questions that are examples of some common threads that I see appearing. I see a lot of people in the chat sort of, thinking through the cascading effects of transportation electrification. And so, for example, Justin Pines asks, with the eventual mass adoption of electric vehicles across the transportation industry, how do you see cities and urban communities needing to adjust so that individuals can charge their cars in densely populated areas? And Justin notes, currently Teslas are much more practical in suburban settings.
Nathan, you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. So, I think that I personally do think that there will be a little bit of a bifurcation in terms of the mobility ecosystems we'll see in urban versus suburban and rural areas. I definitely think, more of the single passenger model will persist for that suburban rural environment where you've got those Teslas, Bolts and whatnot. I think the urban question is a much more interesting one that will be quite a range, perhaps a mix. I think it would be, if you want to look towards what I think are more advanced urban mobility ecosystems, I'd look towards what exists now in Europe and a lot of the urban centers in China. And I'll say that in that I think mobility is more equitable across the board, and that both wealthy and non-wealthy people in those areas tend to take the same, more similar modes of transportation. That's a mix of public transport through subways, buses, as well as a little bit of last mile stuff through bikes, taxis. They also walk. I think there's a range of different policies that can get there. I think in Europe they've done a lot to ban single passenger mobility or single passenger vehicles in cities through higher gas taxes, higher parking fees, all that kind of stuff. So I think we'll see a mix emerge in urban areas, but definitely the traditional model I think will for the most hold for those suburban rural areas.
Great. Ben and Daniel, either one of you have something to add? Yep. Okay. Brian Cohen, let's go back to you for the last question.
Yeah, so another common thread here in the chat box is questions related to batteries and storage capability generally. So I'll give the last question to Lauren Shum, who's a 2017 Pratt graduate, and as it happens, is going to be speaking on our Women in Energy panel tomorrow at 3 p.m. Info at energy.duke.edu, so quick plug there. Lauren's question her question states, increasing the range of vehicles can come from increasing battery density, but also from decreasing the power draw of the vehicle itself. What's being done to reduce the power draw of vehicles? For example, reducing auxiliary load or increasing drive power efficiency.
It's a great question. Daniel, let's start with you on that.
So I think one thing that the OEMs, so I've done a decent amount of work with the OEMs who are thinking about vehicle innovation, and I think as they're thinking about it, they are thinking about it more from a efficiency standpoint in terms of it's less about like the battery and more about how do we make the vehicle more efficient to comply with some of the regulations in a place like California. Which has always set the standard for having the most efficient fuel economy standards. So I guess speaking from the OEM standpoint, in terms of vehicle, reducing the weight of the vehicle, things like that, I guess it's part of the entire fuel efficiency play, and whether, and a lot of that depends on what the federal government or the state governments do in terms of setting standards. So a lot of it is a reaction to, oh, we have to comply in California because that's going to be the floor. We want to sell our cars in California. They need to be this efficient. So we're going to solve for that. We're going to solve for California. And I think some of those, behaviors will play out throughout the rest of the sector as electric vehicles become more dominant.
Ben, anything you want to add, or Nathan?
Yeah, I think on the truck side, they're also looking at reducing the weight, and so instead of having, say, as much steel as they do on the truck, they would switch it to, say, carbon composites. So dramatically reducing the weight. So you could take a class 6 truck, so to speak, with its gross vehicle weight of 19,000 and maybe modify it in such a way that it reduces its GVW down to 12,000, to 14,000, thereby needing a lot less batteries in the vehicle. So maybe going from 4 packs of batteries down to 2 or 3. And that's one way of making the batteries more efficient, is reducing the truck weight. The other way is just through more efficient managed charging. And so if you know exactly the routes that these fleets are going to take, be much more mindful about how you charge the batteries. And that way you protect and preserve the value of the battery. So as it goes into its secondary life, 6, 8, 10 years from now, it has a lot higher value because now you've kind of really managed the charging of that battery for the last 6, 8, 10 years.
Super. Thank you, Ben. So I had a great time moderating the three of you. So Nathan, Ben, and Daniel, thank you. I want to turn it back to Brian Murray and let Brian have the opportunity to give some closing remarks.
Well, thank you, Husein, and thanks so much to all of our panelists for spending time with us, and to all of you for taking part, all of the participants. I think the chat box is like a master class and excellent questions, not just questions, but offering your own thoughts about this really exciting topic. I also want to give a special shout out to several folks from the Energy Initiative: Stacey Peterson, Brian Cohen, Angela Edwards, Braden Wellborn, and Jacob Bratch, for all they did to prepare for this and to execute this on what, at least from my end, looked fairly seamless execution. So please consider following us on social media if you don't do that already. The links should be in the chat box for Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, And I think that's it. And sign up for our newsletter as well. Also, watch your inbox for a survey about today's virtual event. Please take a moment to let us know what you think and how we can improve things. Like I said, we're new at doing this, but we plan to host more events like this one in the future, including, as was just mentioned, tomorrow. And your feedback would be really valuable. So again, thanks so much for joining us today and for participating in what I think was a really exciting event. Everyone, give yourself a round of applause. Thank you very much.